Okay, next we're going to talk about the risk of loss. And what I mean when I say that is who bears the risk when the goods are destroyed, maybe before they reach the buyer, or in transit, or when they're still with the seller, or when they're with the buyer, but not all the contract has been completed yet. All those kinds of issues we deal with in this category called risk of loss. So in order to start, let me give you an example. Let me say that I have a business on my own where I make bobblehead dolls. And I make bobbleheads of Western Illinois University administrators, and they're wildly popular. And let's say that I get a big order for bobbleheads from Goldfarb, who's in California. And he wants to buy so many of these that I have to ship them by train. I have to get a whole train car and ship them out there. So we have a contract, and he's going to buy all these bobbleheads from me, and I'm going to ship them out to California. Well, what happens if I load my bobbleheads onto the train, and the train makes it about halfway, somewhere into Kansas maybe, and the train derails, and just like in the movies, the train derails, the car rolls down the hill, and then explodes at the bottom of the hill. All of the bobbleheads are completely destroyed. Do I get paid? As the seller, do I still get paid for those bobbleheads? Or does Goldfarb not have to pay for them? Are they still mine, or are they his? Who bears the risk of loss when those bobbleheads are destroyed halfway between here and California? Well, we're going to deal with those issues. And as we can say, the question that we ask versus who bears the risk of loss, and this is answered at least in part by UCC section 2-5094. We're going to find out that there's two sections of the UCC that deal with this, 509 and 510. Well, let's start with 509.4, which allows the parties to allocate the risk of loss in the contract. So when I contract with Goldfarb, we can spell out who bears the risk of loss and when it passes from the seller to the buyer. We can do that using shipping terms. Now, I've included some of the traditional shipping terms on the slide, but they're not all there. There's some more international shipping terms that you can go and Google, and there's a whole bunch of these that certain industries use all the time, but these are just some of the more common. As we can see, we can put in our contract that the goods will be FOB and then placed of destination. So in my example, it would be FOB Los Angeles. FOB just stands for free on board the transit. So when we use FOB destination, like Los Angeles, then the seller bears the risk of loss until the goods arrive at that destination. So if we just put the shipping term FOB Los Angeles and the goods are destroyed before they reach Los Angeles, then they're still mine, the sellers. I don't get paid. I bear that risk of loss. But we could also use FOB place of shipment. Right? So if we put free on board or FOB Chicago, where I take my bobbleheads to load them onto the train, then the seller bears the risk of loss until the goods are in the carrier's possession. So I bear the risk of loss until the goods reach Chicago. Once I give them to the carrier, then the risk is on the buyer from there on to Los Angeles. And so in my example, if the train derailed somewhere in Kansas, then I would still get paid. Those are the buyer's bobbleheads at that point. There are some others, FAS, which is free alongside. This is usually used when we have a named vessel like a ship, like if we use FAS, Titanic or something, well then the seller delivers them to a named vessel and the risk of loss shifts once the goods are delivered to that vessel. So if we're going to use the Titanic and I deliver my goods to the Titanic and put them on the boat, then the risk of loss passes to the buyer. And so if the Titanic hits the iceberg, those are the buyer's bobbleheads at the bottom of the ocean. Next, we have CIF, which is cost, insurance, and freight. This is where I'm indicating by using the shipping term that the cost of the goods already includes the cost of shipping and insurance. So the price of the goods includes cost of insurance and freight, and the seller retains the risk during the shipment. So whatever shipment's going to be done, if I use CIF, then what I'm telling the buyers, I've already charged you for the cost of shipping and for insurance during the shipping time. Or I could just use C and F, which is cost and freight. This is where I'm telling the buyer that the price of goods only includes the cost of the item and the shipping, but there's no insurance. This indicates that the seller's risk ends once the delivery is made to the carrier, and then the buyer has to have his own insurance or make arrangements for risk of loss once the goods reach the carrier. So we can use those shipping terms, and we can always indicate between the parties to the contract, in the contract, how we want to allocate risk of loss. What if we don't say? What if we don't use any shipping terms, or we just don't address risk of loss at all? Well, then it's going to depend, and this is where it gets a little tedious with some of the rules. We're either going to use Section 509 of Article 2 of the UCC or 510. And whether we use 509 or 510 is going to depend on whether the contract is breached or not. Okay, so let's start out with if neither party breaches the contract. Okay, so as the seller, I ship what we call conforming goods. Conforming just means they conform to the contract requirements. I haven't breached my contract. If neither party breaches, then we use 509, and the risk then depends on what kind of contract we have. If we have a shipment contract is where the seller must ship the goods. So if I have to get the goods under the contract to Los Angeles, then the risk passes to the buyer when the seller delivers the goods to Los Angeles. If it's a destination contract, where we've indicated where the goods are supposed to go, then the seller has to ship the goods, and the risk of loss passes to the buyer when the goods reach that destination. So if we have a shipment contract or a destination contract, the seller has the risk of loss until the goods arrive at that place. What if the goods are being held by a third party? If they are, then we call that a bailment. Bailment is just a legal word to describe when a third party is holding property or goods for someone else. So if we have a bailment for the buyer, then the risk of loss passes when the buyer obtains the documents of title or when the bailee acknowledges the right to the goods. So let's say I'm going to ship my bobbleheads, but I'm not going to ship them directly to Goldfarb's house in California. I'm shipping them to a warehouse that Goldfarb owns in Nevada. Maybe he thinks he can sell these WIU bobbleheads in Las Vegas or something, where a lot of our professors end up. But maybe, whatever reason, he wants me to ship them to a warehouse that he has in Nevada. Well, once the goods arrive in Nevada at the warehouse is has a bailment, is holding them for him, then the risk of loss passes when the ownership documents get to Goldfarb, or when the bailee acknowledges that Goldfarb has the right to the goods. Okay, what if we don't have any of those things? What if we don't have a shipment, a destination contract? What if there's not a bailment? What if the buyer is just supposed to come to the seller's place of business and pick up the goods? They're not going to be shipped anywhere. What happens if I'm the seller and the goods are at my place of business, on my loading dock, so to speak? Well, then it's going to depend on whether I'm a merchant. Now remember, under the UCC Article 2, a person is a merchant if they're in the business of buying and selling goods of a particular type. So if it's my normal business to buy and sell bobbleheads, then I'm a merchant for any contract under the UCC where I sell bobbleheads. So if I'm a merchant, then the risk of loss passes on receipt of the goods by the buyer. So if I have the goods and Goldfarb is supposed to come to my place of business and pick them up, if my place of business burns before he gets there to pick them up, or before the date that we indicate he has to pick them up in the contract, then the risk of loss is mine. I don't get paid for them. The risk of loss doesn't transfer until receipt by the buyer. What if we're not a merchant? What if now, let's say that I ship the bobbleheads to Goldfarb out in California, and he's not a merchant in bobbleheads, but he's got all these bobbleheads now, and he decides that he doesn't want them after all, and so he has a big garage sale, and he just sells them. He's not a merchant. He's not in a regular course of business of doing this, but he has a garage sale and he sells them. And there's an alum who's out in California who sees some of these bobbleheads, a box of them, and wants to buy them at the garage sale. But there's no indication shipment or anything like that. In fact, the buyer says, hey, I don't have my truck with me right now. Let me go get my truck and bring it back tomorrow morning, and then I can take the bobbleheads. And so Goldfarb says, okay, I will have the bobbleheads out on my driveway at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, ready for you to pick up. Okay. If the buyer doesn't come and pick them up at 10, but Goldfarb has performed and they're out there on the driveway, then there's a big windstorm that comes, picks up the crate of bobbleheads and smashes them into the street and destroys them all. Does Goldfarb still get paid? Well, under our rule here, if the seller is not a merchant, then the risk of loss passes upon the seller's tender of the goods. In other words, the point in time at which the seller made the goods ready, willing, and able to be delivered to or given over to the buyer. So in my example there, if Goldfarb put the bobbleheads out on the driveway at 10 a.m. like he said, and the buyer was late and the bobbleheads were destroyed, those are the buyer's bobbleheads. The buyer still has to pay for them. The risk of loss is now transferred. Okay, so those are instances where neither party really breached the contract. What happens if the contract is breached, though? What do we do with risk of loss there? Well, then we go to UCC 2510, and it tells us it depends. It depends on a few things. First, if the seller breaches the contract. In other words, the seller provides what we call non-conforming goods. Non-conforming just means there's a problem with them. They're not as described in the contract. They're broken. They're the wrong color. They're not what the buyer contracted to get. There's a breach by the seller. So if the seller breaches with non-conforming goods, so let's say I ship the bobbleheads out to California, and the bobbleheads reach Goldfarb in California, but there's no heads on them. They didn't get attached beforehand, or in my manufacturing process in my garage, I forgot to attach all the heads and I shipped them anyway. Anyway, they're non-conforming goods and I've breached the contract. Well, in that case, the risk of loss remains with the seller, with me, until I either cure the problem or the buyer accepts them anyway. So in this case, how do I cure the problem? I would have to send the heads to California and then arrange for somebody to install them on each of the bobblehead dolls and fix the problem. Once the problem is fixed, then the risk of loss passes to the buyer. Until then, they're my bobbleheads, and I don't get paid if they're destroyed. Next, if the seller breaches, this is kind of a complicated one. If the seller breaches, the buyer accepts and then revokes acceptance. Then the risk of loss remains with the seller to the extent that the buyer's insurance doesn't cover the problem or the loss. Okay. If you remember our discussion of revocation of acceptance under the UCC, remember under the UCC, if the buyer accepts the goods, but maybe they have a latent or hidden defect in them, and it's not reasonably discoverable at the time of delivery, only discoverable later, and it's a material defect, then the buyer can revoke acceptance. So let's say now I've shipped my bobbleheads to Goldfarb in California. He opens them up. They look fine. He accepts the shipment. And after a couple of days, only when you touch the head of one of the bobbleheads does the head come off and the spring shoots out and the whole thing breaks. And it's a problem with every single one of them. Then Goldfarb contacts me and says, I'm revoking my acceptance. There was a latent defect with these, and I'm revoking my acceptance. And I don't want these. Okay. If after Goldfarb revokes his acceptance, a tornado comes and destroys Goldfarb's garage, including all of the bobbleheads, then the risk of loss is still with the seller. They're still my bobbleheads, and I wouldn't get paid for them. All right. Now, if the buyer does have insurance that will cover a loss of that type, then I might get paid through the insurance. But if not, then the risk of loss is on me. Similarly, next one here, if the buyer breaches before taking possession. So if the buyer is supposed to do something in the contract, pay maybe a certain amount before taking possession and doesn't do that and breaches, then the buyer assumes the risk of loss to the extent that the seller's insurance won't cover. Okay, so let's say now the bobbleheads are supposed to be picked up by Goldfarb, and he's supposed to pay half of the cost before he picks them up, and he doesn't do that. If he doesn't pay, and after he breaches the contract by failing to pay, the bobbleheads are destroyed, there's a fire at my place of business and all of his bobbleheads that have been identified to the contract for him have been destroyed, then it's his risk of loss because he was the one that breached. And I might have insurance that would cover that, but if I don't, then he would bear the risk of loss there. Okay, now I know that this slide is hard to read. The type is small, it may be a little bit blurry, and what it represents is a flow chart. And I understand it may be difficult, but this same flow chart is in your textbook. It's in the chapter on risk of loss, and you can find it there, or you could print out maybe the slides and enlarge it or look at it somehow. Anyway, I put this in here because some people just learn better through pictures or by flow chart, and so this is basically a flow chart that shows you how to determine risk of loss. It's all the rules that we just went through, and you start at the top and kind of go through and find out first at the top left if there's no breach, right? Those are kind of the yellow ones. You go through a 509, and then you ask yourself a few questions like, does the contract require the seller to ship the goods by carrier? If so, then you follow the arrows. On the right side, if there's a breach, those rules that we just went through. So anyway, I wanted to just bring that to your attention. And I know it's difficult to read here on the slide, but if you look it up in the textbook, it might help you learn this. And again, I almost want to apologize for the UCC and the rules of risk of loss because they are sort of complicated and convoluted, and there's really no other way than to just memorize this.